People think the medieval spice trade was about hiding the taste of rotten meat. That's the story we all hear. It makes sense on the surface, no refrigerators, so meat went bad quickly. Spices have strong flavors. Put them together, and you can eat something that would otherwise make you gag. But that's not the whole story. It's not even the most important part of the story. The truth is, if you were rich enough to afford spices, you were rich enough to afford fresh meat. A lord with a castle had his own livestock. He wasn't eating 3-week-old mutton. So why do they spend fortunes on a pinch of pepper or a stick of cinnamon? The real answer is a mix of things. But the biggest one is status. Spices were the ultimate luxury good. They were the medieval equivalent of a supercar or a designer watch. They came from lands that were almost mythical to Europeans, places they called the Indies or Cathay. These places were so far away, the journey so dangerous, that the spices that arrived in Europe were worth more than their weight in gold. Sometimes much more. When a king held a feast, he wasn't just feeding his guests. He was showing them his power. And nothing showed power like a mountain of spices. Imagine a plate of food so covered in black pepper it looked like it was dusted with dirt. To us, that might seem disgusting. To a medieval noble, it was a statement. It said, I am so wealthy I can afford to waste a fortune on a single meal. I can use a spice that traveled thousands of miles through deserts and overseas just to season this piece of chicken. Ginger, cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon. These weren't just flavors, they were symbols of immense wealth and global connections. The more exotic the spice, the more powerful the host. Some aristocrats even had their own spice merchants, just like people today have personal shoppers. They would compete to find the rarest spice to create the most shocking and flavorful dish. It was a form of conspicuous consumption. You were eating your money, and you wanted everyone to see it. Then there was medicine. Medieval medicine was based on the idea of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Your health depended on these four fluids being in balance. The sickness was just an imbalance. Everything you ate, everything in the environment had properties. It was either hot or cold and wet or dry. Most European foods, especially things like fish and vegetables, were considered cold and wet. Spices, on the other hand, were seen as the opposite. They were hot and dry. So, to balance your humors and stay healthy, you needed to add spices to your food. This wasn't just a folk belief, it was the mainstream science of the day. Doctors and scholars wrote long texts about it. A physician would prescribe a diet heavy in cinnamon to counteract a cold and moist ailment. And ginger was used for stomach problems. Cloves were used for toothaches. They made complex powders and drinks from spices to treat everything from the common cold to the plague. Spices were kept in an apothecary's shop right next to the dried herbs and minerals. They were medicine. So when a lord ate a heavily spiced meal, he wasn't just showing off his wealth. He was also showing that he was sophisticated enough to care for his health in the most scientific way known at the time. And finally, there was religion. The church was a huge consumer of spices. Think about the smell of a cathedral during a major service. The air is thick with incense. That incense was made from frankincense and myrrh, aromatic resins that came from the Middle East and Africa. They were spices, part of the same trade network. The smell was supposed to be otherworldly. It was the scent of the holy, a way to make the church feel like a gateway to heaven. Spices were mentioned in the Bible. The three wise men brought gold, frankincense, and myrrh to the baby Jesus. This gave them a sacred quality. Using them in church services connected the congregation to the very foundations of their faith. So, the craving wasn't simple. It wasn't just about bad meat, it was about a deep desire for status, a genuine belief in their medical power, and a connection to the divine. This powerful combination of wants created a demand that was almost insatiable. It was a demand that people were willing to kill for. And it was a demand that would push European civilization to risk everything to control the supply. The whole medieval world was hooked on these fragrant powders from the East, and they would do anything to get them. The journey was almost impossible. A peppercorn on a plate in England had traveled further, and through more hands than almost any other object in the medieval world. It began in a place most Europeans couldn't even find on a map. They knew it was in the East, a vague, almost magical land of riches. The most valuable spices like cloves, nutmeg, and mace came from a tiny cluster of islands in modern-day Indonesia. The Banda Islands, or the Spice Islands, these islands were the only place in the world where these trees grew. The journey started there, with local farmers harvesting the spice. They would then sell it to local traders. These traders would load the spices onto small boats and sail to larger ports in Java or Sumatra. There, the spices would be sold again, this time to merchants from further afield. The Chinese, Indian, and Arab traders all converged on these ports. This was the first major step up in price. The spices were now on the international market, but they were still in Southeast Asia. From there, the main route was by sea. Arab and Indian sailors were masters of the Indian Ocean. They understood the monsoon winds better than anyone. They had ships, called dhows, that were perfect for these waters. They would sail with the wind, carrying their precious cargo of spices from Indonesia and Malaysia towards India. India itself was a source of spices, most importantly, black pepper from the Malabar coast. So, ships would stop there, trading some spices and picking up others. The cargo was getting more and more valuable. After crossing the Indian Ocean, the ships would head for one of two main destinations: the Persian Gulf, heading towards Baghdad, or the Red Sea, heading towards Egypt. The Red Sea route became the most important one for Europe. The dhows would navigate the treacherous waters and unload their cargo at a port like Jeddah on the Arabian Peninsula. By now, the spices had traveled thousands of miles by sea, and they were about to begin the next leg of their journey. From the Red Sea ports, the spices were loaded onto the backs of camels. This was the overland part of the route. Great caravans, sometimes with thousands of camels, would walk for weeks across the harsh, sun-baked deserts of Arabia and Egypt. They were heading for the Nile River. This was a dangerous part of the journey. Bandits were a constant threat. The heat was brutal. A single lost camel could mean the loss of a fortune. The men who led these caravans were tough and knew the desert intimately. Yeah, they navigated by the stars, moving from one oasis to the next. Once they reached the Nile, the spices were loaded onto boats again, this time for a short trip downriver to a major port on the Mediterranean Sea. The most important port for this trade was Alexandria in Egypt. Alexandria was the great meeting point. It was the gateway between the East and the West. Here, the Arab merchants who had controlled the spices all the way from India and beyond would finally sell them to Europeans. The spices had passed through maybe a dozen different hands since they were picked from a tree. And at every single stop, at every sale, the price went up. Every merchant, every sailor, every camel driver, every port official took their cut. Taxes were levied by local rulers at every stage. The cost of a peppercorn in Alexandria was already 100 times what it was in India. But the journey wasn't over yet. The final leg was across the Mediterranean, and this part of the trade was controlled by a handful of Italian city-states. The most powerful of these was Venice. Venetian merchants had special arrangements with the Mamluk sultans of Egypt. They had warehouses in Alexandria, they bought the spices in massive quantities, loaded them onto their own galley ships, and sailed them back to Italy. This was also a dangerous voyage. The Mediterranean was full of pirates. Rival cities like Genoa would sometimes attack Venetian ships. The weather could be unpredictable. Once the spices reached Venice, they were stored in huge state-controlled warehouses. Venice was now the spice capital of Europe. From here, the spices were sold one last time to merchants from all over the continent. From Germany, France, England, these merchants would then transport the spices by river or by road to their final destinations. A small pouch of cloves that ended up in a castle in Scotland had completed a journey that could take over a year. It had crossed oceans, deserts, and seas. It had been bought and sold by people who spoke different languages and worshipped different gods. The sheer complexity and risk of this supply chain is what made spices so astronomically expensive. It wasn't just a commodity, it was a miracle it arrived at all. In Europe, one city dominated the spice trade. That city was Venice. Venice was unique. It was a city built on water, a republic run by a council of merchants. Its power didn't come from vast farmlands or a large army. It came from its ships and its control of trade. And the most lucrative trade of all was the spice trade. The Venetians were masters of the game. They positioned themselves as the essential middlemen between the East and the West. Their genius was in politics as much as it was in sailing. In the early medieval period, other Italian cities like Genoa and Pisa were also major players. But Venice outmaneuvered them all. They made a crucial deal. They negotiated a treaty with the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. The Mamluks controlled Alexandria, the port where most of the spices arrived from the Red Sea. The treaty gave Venetian merchants exclusive, or near-exclusive, rights to buy spices there. They set up their own trading posts, called fondacos, right in the city. They had their own docks, warehouses, and living quarters. This deal was the foundation of a monopoly. If you were a king in France or a duke in Germany and you wanted pepper, you had to buy it from Venice. Or you had to buy it from a merchant who had bought it from Venice. The Venetians controlled the tap. They could decide how many spices flowed into Europe, and they could set the price. And they set it high. The wealth that poured into Venice as a result was staggering. The magnificent palaces along the Grand Canal, the stunning art of St. Mark's Basilica, the power of the Venetian state, it was all built on the profits from pepper, cloves, and cinnamon. The system was incredibly well organized. The Venetian state itself managed the trade. They sent out protected fleets of galleys, called the Muda system, at regular intervals. These weren't just a bunch of private ships. They were state-sponsored convoys protected by warships. They sailed to Alexandria and other ports in the Levant, like Beirut, on a strict schedule. This minimized risk and maximized efficiency. When the ships returned to Venice, laden with spices, the city celebrated. The goods were offloaded and stored in state warehouses. The state took a hefty tax, and then the spices were sold to merchants from across Europe who flocked to Venice's Rialto market. This monopoly made Venice powerful, but it also made them a lot of enemies. Their main rival was the Republic of Genoa. Genoa was also a maritime power, and they fought a series of brutal wars with Venice over control of the trade routes. These weren't small skirmishes, they were full-scale naval battles for the economic soul of Europe. For a time, Genoa had its own routes, often through the Black Sea and connecting to the overland Silk Road. But the Venetian grip on the main spice route through Egypt was stronger. In the end, Venice came out on top. The relationship with the Mamluks was also complicated. European leaders, including the Pope, were often horrified that Venice was trading so closely with a Muslim power. Sometimes they called for embargoes and crusades. But Venice was pragmatic. Business was business. They knew the Mamluks were their ticket to the riches of the East, and they weren't going to let religious differences get in the way of profit. They paid their taxes to the Sultan, followed the local laws, and kept the spices flowing. They were brokers, not crusaders. This control had a profound effect on the European economy. The flow of gold and silver drained out of Europe and into Venetian and Mamluk hands. Other kingdoms resented their dependence on Venice. They saw the Venetians as price-gouging monopolists who were getting rich at their expense. This resentment was a slow-burning fire. Kings and merchants in Portugal, Spain, and England dreamed of a day when they could bypass Venice entirely. They wondered if there was another way to get to the source of the spices, a way to cut out all the middlemen, the Arabs, the Mamluks, and, most of all, the Venetians. The Venetian monopoly was a source of incredible strength for the city, but it also planted the seeds of its own destruction. By controlling the trade so tightly, they gave everyone else the motivation to find a new way. The spice trade did more than just make Venice rich. It reshaped medieval society in fundamental ways. It wasn't just about what was on the dinner table of a few lords. Its effects rippled through the economy, culture, and politics of the entire continent. It was one of the engines that slowly pulled Europe out of the so-called Dark Ages and into a more modern, more connected world. Economically, it helped create modern finance. The spice trade was a business of immense scale and risk. A merchant might have to put up a huge amount of capital to fund a voyage that wouldn't see a return for a year or more, if it returned at all. You couldn't just carry chests of gold coins across the sea. It was too dangerous. So, merchants in Italy invented new tools. They developed early forms of banking, credit, and insurance. A merchant in Venice could buy a bill of exchange, a type of IOU, and use it to get cash from a partner bank in Alexandria. This was much safer than carrying gold. They created joint stock companies where multiple investors could pool their money to fund a trading venture. If the ship sank, everyone lost a little, but if it came back full of cloves, everyone got rich. These financial innovations, born from the needs of the spice trade, laid the groundwork for capitalism. It also fueled the growth of cities. Places like Venice and Genoa became bustling hubs of international commerce. But it wasn't just them. Cities along the trade routes inland, like Nuremberg and Augsburg in Germany, grew wealthy as centers of distribution and finance. A new class of people rose to prominence: the urban merchant. These weren't nobles who inherited land and titles. They were commoners who became powerful through their skill in business. Their wealth began to rival that of the old landed aristocracy. This created new social tensions, but it also made society more dynamic. Money began to compete with land as the primary source of power. Culturally, the spice trade opened up Europe's worldview. For much of the early Middle Ages, Europe was relatively isolated and inward-looking. The trade with the East changed that. Along with the spices came stories, ideas, and technologies. Europeans heard tales of the great Khans of the Mongols, the wealth of India, and the sophisticated civilization of China. Marco Polo's famous journey was, at its heart, a business trip along these trade routes. His book fired the imagination of Europe. It told them of a world far bigger and richer than their own. Knowledge flowed back with the trade goods. Navigational techniques from the Arab world, like the use of the astrolabe and a better understanding of maps, slowly made their way to Europe. So did mathematical concepts like Arabic numerals, which were far more efficient for business than Roman numerals. The luxury goods themselves, silks, porcelain, and of course, spices, gave Europeans a taste of a more refined, more advanced material culture. It created a hunger not just for the goods themselves, but for the knowledge and the world that produced them. It made them curious. But it wasn't all positive. The trade also highlighted and reinforced the vast gap between the rich and the poor. For 99% of the population, a peasant working the fields, spices were a complete fantasy. They might hear about them, they might smell them on the breath of a priest, but they would never taste them. The spice trade was exclusively for the elite. It was part of a system that extracted wealth from the labor of the many and concentrated it in the hands of the few. The immense profits also fueled conflict. As we saw, Venice and Genoa fought wars over it, and the constant drain of gold and silver to the east was a major economic problem for European kingdoms. They had a massive trade deficit, they wanted the spices, but the east didn't want many of their goods in return. So they had to pay in precious metals. This desire to find new sources of gold and silver and to control the source of the spices directly became a powerful political obsession. The world that the spice trade built was richer, more connected, and more complex. But it was also more competitive and more unequal. It created the very pressures that would soon lead to its own violent transformation. The medieval spice trade, with Venice at its heart, seemed like a system that could last forever. It was entrenched, profitable, and had survived for centuries. But two major events happened in the 15th century that would bring it all crashing down. One was a slow-building technological revolution. The other was a geopolitical earthquake. The earthquake came first. In 1453, the Ottoman Empire, a rising Turkish power, conquered Constantinople. This sent a shockwave through Europe. The Ottomans now controlled the gateway to the Black Sea and the old northern trade routes. Over the next few decades, they continued to expand, taking over much of the Middle East, including, eventually, Egypt in 1517. The Mamluk Sultanate, Venice's longtime trading partner, was gone. The Ottomans now controlled the choke point of the entire spice trade. They didn't cut off the trade completely. They were happy to profit from it. But they added their own taxes and made the route more difficult and even more expensive. The Venetian monopoly, already resented, became almost unbearable. The price of pepper in Europe shot up. The old system was breaking. At the same time, a quiet revolution was happening on the docks of Portugal and Spain. Shipbuilders were developing new kinds of ships. The medieval galley, powered by oarsmen, was fine for the Mediterranean. But it was useless in the open ocean. The new ship was the caravel. It was small, light, and fast. It used latent sails, a triangular design borrowed from Arab dhows, which allowed it to sail against the wind. It was a vessel designed for exploration. Alongside the new ships came better navigational tools. The compass was more reliable. The astrolabe allowed sailors to calculate their latitude from the stars. Maps were becoming more accurate. For the first time, European sailors had the technology to attempt long-distance ocean voyages far from the sight of land. These two developments came together in one small country on the edge of Europe, Portugal. The Portuguese were a seafaring people, but they were shut out of the lucrative Mediterranean trade. They had a long Atlantic coastline and a deep desire to find their own path to riches. They had a powerful motivation to bypass the Venetians and the Ottomans. Prince Henry the Navigator sponsored voyages down the coast of Africa, pushing further and further south with each expedition. Their initial goal was to find gold and to outflank the Muslim powers of North Africa. But the ultimate prize was always in the back of their minds, finding a sea route to India. A way to get to the spices. It was a slow, painstaking process that took decades. Finally, in 1488, Bartolomeo Diaz rounded the southern tip of Africa, which he called the Cape of Good Hope. The way was open. 10 years later, in 1497, another Portuguese sailor, Vasco da Gama, set off with 4 ships to finish the job. His voyage was epic. He sailed down the coast of Africa, rounded the Cape, and then struck out across the unknown Indian Ocean. He had help from an Arab pilot he picked up in East Africa. In 1498, he landed in Calicut on the pepper-rich Malabar coast of India. He had done it. He had bypassed the entire Old World Order. He had cut out the camel caravans, the Red Sea sailors, the Mamluk sultans, and the Venetian merchants. He was at the source. The local Indian ruler was not particularly impressed with the cheap goods Da Gama offered for trade, but Da Gama managed to load his ships with a cargo of spices. The return journey was brutal. Many of his men died of scurvy, but when his surviving ships limped back into Lisbon in 1499, they caused a sensation. The spices they carried were worth 60 times the cost of the entire expedition. This was the beginning of the end for the medieval spice trade. The Portuguese quickly followed up on da Gama's success. They sent powerful naval fleets to the Indian Ocean, using their superior cannon technology to blast their way to a trading empire. They seized key ports and established forts. Soon, they were shipping spices back to Lisbon via the all-sea route around Africa. The price of pepper in Lisbon plummeted, undercutting the Venetians completely. The economic center of Europe shifted almost overnight from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. Venice began a long, slow decline, and it wasn't just the Portuguese. A few years before da Gama's voyage, an Italian sailor named Christopher Columbus had convinced the King and Queen of Spain that he could get to the spices by sailing west. He was wrong about the size of the world. He didn't find India. He found a whole new continent instead. But his motivation was the same: the global scramble for empire, the age of exploration, colonialism, the conquest of the Americas. It was all kicked off by this desperate, centuries-old European craving for the fragrant seeds and barks of distant islands. The medieval spice trade was over, but its legacy had just redrawn the map of the world.